Hello. So this is our shooting star corn beanbag tutorial. And what we're seeing right now is glass gem corn, which was grown on our property. You can see that each cob has all sorts of really beautiful different colors on it. So what we're going to do is take the kernels off the cob, which you can do by just using your thumbs to pop the kernels off, and some of the cobs are a little looser, and you should be able to just kind of wring your hands around it to loosen those kernels. So we're going to take all of the kernels off of the cobs, add them to a bowl so that they're a little easier to get to. And this leftover cob, if you compost, you can throw it in there. If you have chickens, I believe that they like cobs, but what you're left with is just these really pretty multicolored kernels that you can use to make popcorn. You can grind them up when they're nice and dry to make masa, but we're going to use them to do some crafting today. So what we're going to need for shooting stars, we're going to need obviously our glass gem corn kernels. We're going to need some straight pins, a needle, and some thread. What I've used here is embroidery thread, which makes it a little bit easier for little hands, just in case you've got some kids that you're doing some crafting with. In this demonstration, I just use one straight pin, but you can use more than one if that makes it easier for you. Some fabric. It's great if you have some scraps on hand that you can repurpose or recycle. And then some scissors. And then lastly, whatever ribbon you have around, and you can really make it at any length that you'd like, but this is going to be the tail of our shooting star. So I've got 3 pieces here that I found here in our culinary classroom. So I've folded the fabric in half. There are a number of different ways that you can do this. If you have a sewing machine, you can use your sewing machine. I'm just doing it by hand with needle and thread. So ultimately, you can also cut the fabric whatever shape you want your beanbag to be. I decided to go with a circle. So I just folded my fabric in half, and I'm cutting 2 circles out of it, which you'll see when I pull it apart. They match perfectly. Yeah, and there you go. Some nice firefly fabric and my circles. So you're going to take your tail, match up one of the ends. Now, if you're doing this by hand, you can just do a nice, highly visible outside stitch, which is what I did today. If you are a little more advanced, you can flip the fabric inside out, but for this demonstration, we're just going to do a nice outside stitch, which means we take our tail, we put it inside the 2 matching pieces of fabric, and use a straight pin to secure those ribbons inside of what will be the shell of the beanbag. So you can see the pin goes all the way through, and that just keeps the ribbon in place while we do the stitching and the filling up with corn. And of course, just make sure you don't stick yourself. Just be really mindful and pay close attention when you're working with sharp objects. So what I'm going to do now is get the needle all set up with the embroidery floss. If you're using embroidery floss, you're going to want to use a needle with a larger eye. And again, this is a size of needle and thread that I like to use with my own kids because it makes it a little bit easier. You're going to make a knot at the end of the thread just by making a loop around a finger and then just kind of winding it together and pulling it until it's taut. And then you just get to work stitching. And I was trying to do this in a way that was visible to the camera while also not driving that needle underneath my nail. So if I pop out of frame for a second, don't worry, I'll be back in the frame. But I like to make that initial stitch in a way that the end knot is hidden inside the fabric. You absolutely don't have to worry about that, but that's just for looks. And then you do a nice loop stitch all the way around, almost all the way around the outside of the fabric. And you're just going to use these stitches to close up the beanbag. So while I'm moving along in the stitches, you'll see I'm trying to make nice even width between each one, making sure it's secure. And now we're getting to the tail. So I can't really do the loop stitch. I'm just gonna do a different stitch here. And what ended up happening with this shooting star is once we threw it around a bunch of times, those stitches holding the ribbons actually popped loose because they were not as secure as the loop stitch. So if I were to do this again, I would make them a little bit tighter and more stitches securing that ribbon. I got a little bit of a traffic jam with my thread, so just take your time and pull it through. And actually what you can do is you can go back and forth a few times over that ribbon. I just pulled the straight pin out because I don't need it anymore, but you can go back and do a couple of rounds of stitches over the ribbon just to make sure it's extra secure. So I'm continuing around the periphery of the fabric, and you're going to go all the way around except for one little window, which is where you're going to fill it with the corn, and we'll get there in just a second. A few more stitches. Boop. Nice and secure, especially if you're going to have little hands throwing these all around. Okay, and it looks like we're just about ready. Always keep track of that needle. Always know where that needle is. That is not a fun surprise to step on or lay your hand on a sharp needle. I'm going to be extra careful. So now we're going to take our glass gem corn and we're going to fill up our bean bag. It's a fun sound. I'm going to make it nice and full. There's a little more room, so I'm going to put a little bit more in. I think that's about it. You don't want it so full that it makes it hard to finish the stitching. But you can see in here, it's not quite all the way full, but there's enough to give it some good weight when you're throwing it around. So now I've got my bean bag filled up. I'm going to pick my needle back up carefully, and I'm going to finish those stitches. Very carefully without piercing my thumb, hopefully. And you'll see I'm just going to finish those loop stitches. I don't know if that's what they're officially called. That's what I call them, loop stitches, along the edge until I get back to where I started. And the fun thing about this craft, one of the fun things about this craft, if you can't tell already, is I am not a professional seamstress by any stretch of the imagination. My grandmother taught me how to sew when I was super little, when I was about, 7 years old. And I do it here and there. I do have a sewing machine, but I really think it's fun to do it by hand for crafts like this, because it's fun to do work with your hands. But you don't need to be a professional. This is something that you can just practice. You can do it as a family. It's a great way to use up things that you have around the house, extra ribbon, extra fabric. And so what I'm going to do now, I've got it all stitched up. I'm going to stitch my closing knot. So I just like to pull it through and then loop it back through the thread to tie a knot. And then once you do that once, you find that same knot and just do it 1 or 2 more times, make it extra secure. See? Nice and tight. And then give it a little snip. Enough thread left over that the knot's not going to come undone, but not too much that you've got like an extra tail. And that's that. That is a shooting star. And I'm feeling fancy. So I'm just going to pinch the very end together and cut it a diagonal, and then, ooh, you get a fun little tail. And then that's that. The only thing left to do is take it outside and throw it around.